Our Gatorade game leaders, we take a look at Joel Klatt's top 10. You will notice a couple of differences from the committee. He has Indiana higher than Penn State, Hoosiers 4th, Nittany Lions 6th. Also has Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia higher up than where the committee does. And undefeated BYU is not in his top 10.
And pleased to be joined now by Fox Sports lead game analyst Joel Klatt. Joel, it's always fun to talk to you at this time of the week because we've seen those Tuesday college football playoff rankings. Last week, you had some disagreements with the committee. You and I agreed that we thought that Indiana had been underrated by the committee. What do you think of what they did with the Hoosiers this week?
Yeah, it was quite an adjustment, wasn't it?
It was.
I mean, for really them and BYU, Rev, you know, and we had argued, at least I had, that I thought that there was some brand bias in the first edition of the college football playoff rankings. That was corrected, it seems like. And what's fascinating to me is that I believe it was corrected based on outside sentiment rather than on-field play. And the reason I feel that way is because both BYU and Indiana probably played their worst games of the year last week, and BYU narrowly defeating Utah in a really emotionally charged game in Salt Lake. And then Indiana, you know, kind of escaping Michigan with a win, and that's a Michigan team that has obviously struggled this year. And yet the committee still moved them up. So now you're sitting there, and last week I thought that Indiana was in a precarious spot whether they would get in with a loss. And I thought that they would be a bubble team even with one loss. Now I feel differently about that. As long as the committee stays consistent based on the way that they rank teams this week, I think that Indiana as an 11-1 would be probably safely in the playoff based on where they're starting right now. And obviously if they win out, then they would have a chance to win the Big Ten and get in automatically.
I'm with you. I think they created a buffer zone for them, which is great. I think they need to be competitive with Ohio State. Clearly, you don't have to win the game. If you win the game, you're in an incredible position.
Exactly.
And then you just need to take care of business against Purdue, and then it feels like they'd be in the college football playoff. Speaking of Purdue, you saw them against Ohio State. Again, it's not the greatest competition last week. It's been a rough year for the Boilers. But what did you learn about the Buckeyes? I mean, every time you see a team in person, I'm guessing you see something a little bit different or a little new. Was there something that stood out there?
Yes, I mean, always with them. And one of the things that I notice with them is that they are more adept and or I should say adaptable this year. And I think that's because Ryan is not calling plays. In the past, they kind of were what they were on both sides of the ball the entire year. And this year, I have seen them change and adapt. And based on the way that the season has gone, I think that the offense looks a little different now than it did prior to the Oregon game. The defense looks a little bit different now than it did after the Oregon game. And because of that, I'm just reminded that Ryan made the decision to step away from play calling duties so he could be a true CEO. So what's fascinating for me, because Rev, you know, like how many years have I been doing this? 10 years with Gus now, 8 years in the Big Ten. And we've covered a lot of Ohio State, yes. A lot of Ohio State. And this is the first time that I noticed that during the course, in particular late in the season, I'm seeing these adjustments from them from a schematic standpoint, from a philosophical standpoint on both sides of the ball. And to me, that's a little bit different this year.
Is there one, particularly on the offensive side, that a layman would understand?
Yeah.
That isn't too complex X and O wise?
Yes, and great question. I'm going to say it's a philosophy of experience, and that philosophy entered the fray when they put Carson Hinsman in at left guard, even though he had not played left guard, and they moved Donovan Jackson out to left tackle. So because of the Josh Simmons injury at left tackle, they were struggling on that side of the offensive line. They tried Zen Mihalski, he gets banged up, and now they're going to play Penn State, and they've got a guy in Austin Sareveld who has played a lot of guard and even started 2 games early in the year for Donovan Jackson at left guard. So it would have been very easy for Ryan Day and that team to just start Austin Sareveld and say, well, he's been playing there, because that's what a normal, you know, thought process and philosophy would be. And yet Ryan, because he's not involved in the play calling duties, can rise above that, and he can look at it from I think a 30,000 foot view and say, what do we really need? And what we really need is experience, in particular in Happy Valley, and to face some of the teams that we're going to see down the line. Carson Hinsman has started an entire year at center. So now I get a guy that has started an entire year, and I can put him in between my two most trustworthy offensive linemen, Donovan Jackson, who's moving out, and Seth McLaughlin, who's the center. That, to me, is a change that I think is unique this year because of the seat that Ryan has and the way that he can kind of analyze this team versus being in the minutia of calling the plays.
Interesting. We're going to see the Buckeyes, of course, this week here on the Big Ten Network. They'll be at Wrigley Field against Northwestern. Assuming they get through that game unscathed, we're going to talk a ton about Indiana and Ohio State, obviously, next week. But just kind of big picture, are there a couple things that stand out as you anticipate what will be a big noon matchup and will be one of the biggest games of the year?
Yeah, well, first of all, I can't wait for that matchup. And what the first thing that I think about is that I think that the superpower for Indiana so far, at least offensively, has been the back shoulder fade. And I know that that's a very specific deal, but nobody throws it better than them. We've talked about it all year long, and it's not that they can just hit you down the field and over the top. It's the fact that when they get the one-on-one, they are so good at the timing and ball placement of that back shoulder fade that they feel like they can beat any one-on-one situation. And that's the one area I think when I watch Ohio State, I would try to attack their defense. I would try to attack their corners. And that's what I think Indiana is going to do. So that matchup stands out to me. I can't wait to see that matchup. I can't wait to see how Ohio State wants to handle their offensive play calling. And specifically meaning, like, how much do you want to huddle and slow the game down and try to wear them down with a run game in order to just kind of grind them out, feeling like they're the more physical team, Ohio State would. So all of those things come to mind, and it's certainly a matchup that I can't wait for. Plus, let's face it, and I deemed this on my podcast, I said this is like the Signetti triangle of suck. He named all these teams in that basketball arena. He said Michigan, Ohio State, and Purdue, and he's got a chance this month to get them all. So this is Signetti's time right now.
Hey, you've got Utah, Colorado on Big Noon this week. I know that one is important to you, first of all, because it's the game you're calling, but also given your history at Colorado. And I'm interested in your perspective on this because the shows that debate this type of thing have been having a field day on this one. So you come at it from a perspective of understanding Colorado and understanding its history, its recent history, and its longer-term history. Which is the better story this year, Colorado or Indiana?
Oh, man. I think that they're equally first of all, those two coaches, I believe, are the only two coaches that I'm considering, and maybe there's others, and I'm being short-sighted. Curt Cignetti and Deion Sanders should be the top two candidates for Coach of the Year. I think we would all agree on that. So to try to say which is a better story is really difficult. I think in the first year with Indiana, the way that this has gone, the JMU infusion from Curt Cignetti and his players at Indiana, it's a remarkable story in particular because they don't have a history of success. And by the way, their history of in football isn't even close to Colorado's history. Remember, exactly. Colorado has Thorpe Award winners, and they've got Butkus winners and a Heisman Trophy winner and a national championship. And this was a premier program from about 88 to 96. They won the Big 12 in 2001, played a lot of big games, obviously, in the early 2000s. Indiana didn't have that. So the scope of the story, I think, is bigger at Indiana, but because of who's doing it at Colorado and the level at which they were playing before he got there, both stories are really incredible in our sport.
They're both great stories, and it doesn't diminish one to say that, hey, I think this one's a better story. I think Indiana's a better story. Again, my bias is I've been in the Big Ten my whole life. I mean, my first Big Ten football game, I was 6 years old. I've been following the league ever since then.
And it's it's Indiana. He's doing this at Indiana.
There's 134 teams in major college football, Joel, and the team that's lost the most games of all those 134 is Indiana.
Yes. So trust me, I am with you. And what he's doing is remarkable. And by the way, the scene at each of those places, when you go to Folsom and you feel the energy from the fan base, and when you go and you're in Bloomington and you feel the energy, I love it. And by the way, how good is a 12-team playoff? Because now these teams are playing real football games that mean everything for the top end of the sport. Like I'm loving this year. I really am.
It should be great. Have a blast this weekend, and then
Thanks,
we'll
man.
look forward to taking an even deeper dive next week into that Indiana-Ohio State game. Thanks, Joel.
You got it. See you, bud.